Katie Bellflower was a seductive 17-year-old, going from one boyfriend to the next.
She was very promiscuous. She used her sexuality to get what she wanted.
She quit playing the field when she hooked up with a handsome and edgy 20-year-old named Mike Simons.
She's so attached to Mike, she doesn't want to share him.
But their fiery passion would be stamped out by a string of brutal crimes.
They found the decomposed remains of a person who'd been shot twice and left for dead.
Now, follow along with investigators as they try to solve this gruesome mystery. From graphic evidence collected at the crime scenes to shocking taped confessions with the suspects.
That's when she wanted me to sneak up and strangle her.
Even the horrifying first-hand account from a victim who crossed paths with the killers and barely escaped with her life.
I'm fighting to get the rope off my neck. She says, I'm gonna kill you too.
October 19th, 2002, San Joaquin County, California. A fisherman was finishing up a day of fishing at a local waterfront when he noticed a peculiar and foul-smelling odor on the wind. Curious, the fisherman followed the scent to a nearby patch of woods, where he made a disturbing discovery.
He saw the remains of an individual. He went to an official who was close by, and sheriffs immediately came out and discovered a fairly decomposed body.
It was clear to police that the body had been in the brush for days, if not weeks.
You have the heat, you have animals. It was pretty gruesome.
You would never be able to identify the body by just looking at it.
While the identity of the remains was a mystery, the remote location suggested that whatever the cause of death, it had not been an accident.
The body was hidden. Someone had left the victim here in the underbrush, in the middle of nowhere, because they didn't want it to be found.
If their hunch was true, detectives knew that their work was just beginning.
Somebody had killed this person, so they have to find out who the murderer is and who the victim is.
But little did investigators then know that answering those questions would expose a disturbing plot, along with a deadly series of atrocities, and evidence that these crimes were the work of two cold-blooded killers desperate to be together.
They would do anything for each other. Nothing was going to stand in their way.
Livermore, California, a small town 40 miles outside San Francisco. Livermore was also home to young Katie Bellflower.
Her parents divorced. Her father lived in Texas, her mother lived in Livermore.
Shuttling back and forth between her two homes left Katie in a personal vacuum.
She felt extremely powerless. You feel out of control of your own life. You're passed back and forth. People decide what should happen to you. It's not pretty.
Katie's struggles continued in school. She had a hard time making friends and floundered academically. But by high school, Katie realized she did have one advantage. She was pretty, which helped Katie finally find something she could control: boys.
She was very promiscuous, had a reputation, and like many girls of divorce, fatherless girls, she used her sexuality to get what she wanted.
She used her sexuality as a way to control boys. You gotta understand, she was from a divorced family. She had never had a father figure in her life, so this was pretty important to her.
But while Katie loved the rush she got from seducing boys, she actually didn't care much for dating them. As soon as she won over a new guy, she would dump him and move on to the next one. For Katie, all that mattered was the thrill of the chase.
She's only interested in the part of the relationship in which she's trying to win the man.
But seducing high school boys was easy, and Katie soon became bored. So in the summer of 2002, Katie set her sights on more difficult prey and found the challenge she craved when she met a handsome and brooding 20-year-old named Mike Simons.
He was the rough, tough guy. He was handsome. He was masculine.
Katie was immediately drawn to Mike and quickly realized that in just 20 years, he'd been through more ups and downs than most people experience in a lifetime. Born in 1982, Mike grew up in Livermore. Like Katie, his childhood was unstable.
He was raised by family members. His immediate mom and dad were not around.
By his teen years, Mike's lack of a defined family had left him bitter. He began acting out, leading to more than a few run-ins with the law.
He was impulsive, confused, enraged, and ashamed. Right from the beginning, he was told, "You're nothing. You are nothing."
Searching for somewhere to belong, Mike attempted to enlist in the military, but was turned down.
He had been in contact with recruiters, however, they weren't going to accept him due to his criminal past.
Mike had been rejected by both his parents and his country. Because of his good looks, Mike never had trouble getting girls. But deep down, Mike craved a deeper and meaningful connection. Something more than the random hookups and casual sex that had filled his time.
He was going girl to girl, looking to fill the emptiness in his life.
But then he met Katie Bellflower. And even though she was known as the queen of casual flings, Mike was not immune to her well-practiced and well-known charms.
Katie began seeing him around. She started flirting with him. It's a beautiful girl. Mike likes it. He's starting to kind of get all these signals from Katie.
For Mike, Katie's sultry persona and alluring sexuality was tantalizing. And for Katie, landing a handsome 20-year-old who was 2 years removed from high school was the ultimate conquest. With each steamy encounter, their connection seemed to grow stronger.
He saw someone who was lonely, who had a childhood almost identical to his. It was easy to fall in love with her.
While Katie found that with Mike, she enjoyed more than just the chase. Unlike all the other boys she'd seduced, she didn't want to get rid of him.
At this point, she's so attached to Mike, she'll do whatever it takes to keep him.
Holding on to Mike, however, would turn out to be easier said than done. As it turned out, Mike Simons had a secret. And when revealed, Mike's secret would not only put his romance with Katie in jeopardy, but also set off a chain of horrible and unimaginable events. Coming up, Mike's intense romance with Katie is overshadowed by an explosive crime.
There was a car engulfed in flames.
And a surprising clue suggests the identity of the victim found in the woods.
Maybe she wanted to disappear and just get away from all the drama.
After earning a reputation for seducing and then leaving a string of high school boyfriends, 17-year-old Katie Bellflower had found a man she finally wanted to settle down with. 20-year-old Mike Simons.
Now she's so attached to Mike, she doesn't want to share him. She wants to keep him all to herself.
But Katie was about to learn that holding on to Mike Simons wouldn't be easy. Mike was hiding a secret. And when revealed, it would make people wonder if Katie Bellflower had gotten in over her head by latching onto a man with a shady past. It began in the early hours of October 7th, 2002, when local 911 received an alarming call.
There was a car engulfed in flames.
Firefighters rushed to the scene and quickly got the flames under control. To their relief, there was no one inside the car. But what had caused the blaze?
Cars just don't catch on fire in the middle of a parking lot. Is this insurance fraud? Is it vandalism? What's going on here?
In order to find out more, investigators needed to talk to the vehicle's owner. Luckily, the license plate was still intact.
Well, their first priority was to identify who the car belonged to and where that person was. It belonged to an elderly female who resided in the city of Livermore.
When police contacted the owner, she seemed surprised to learn the car had been destroyed in a fire. The car was registered in her name, but it actually belonged to her granddaughter.
The car belonged to her 17-year-old granddaughter, Jenna Nanetti.
But where was Jenna now? Jenna's grandmother told investigators that Jenna hadn't returned home the previous night. Neither had her husband. And the last Jenna's grandmother had heard from her was in a strange and troubling voicemail her granddaughter had left on her phone.
How are we gonna keep her shit? He's so bad or whatever it was. He's in your house. Call me.
Jenna indicated that she had been in an altercation, but she was okay, she was with friends, and she was headed to the city of Concord, California, which is about maybe a 45-minute drive. She refused to tell her who she was with, and that telephone call was terminated.
Jenna's grandmother had been alarmed by the message and tried to call her granddaughter back.
It just went right to voicemail. That was of concern to us. We didn't know if she was injured or hurt or had been killed or had just run away.
Also of concern was the whereabouts of Jenna's husband. Police asked Jenna's grandmother if she could provide his name. That's when she revealed Jenna's husband was 20-year-old Mike Simons. According to her grandmother, Jenna and Mike were newlyweds. They'd gotten married 4 months earlier.
So that meant that Mike had been married when he and Katie got together. He'd been having an affair.
Jenna's family and friends told police that she'd met Mike in December of 2001. Introduced by mutual friends, the couple quickly clicked, and Mike didn't waste time in popping the question.
He proposed to her, and when they got married, he moved into her grandparents' house. They needed to get permission because she was underage, and her grandmother gave permission.
After the wedding, Mike and Jenna moved in with her grandmother until they could get on their feet. The grandmother also gave the couple a generous wedding gift.
The grandmother gave her a car, sort of like saying, I approve of the marriage.
But the honeymoon obviously hadn't lasted. Jenna's family told police they all knew about Mike's affair with Katie Bellflower, and it had almost ended their brief marriage. Jenna had learned of Mike's infidelity when he admitted to the affair just 2 weeks after they got married. The revelation had been doubly painful for Jenna because Katie Bellflower was one of her old high school classmates. And apparently, going after taken men had always been Katie's M.O.
She seemed to have a habit of setting her sights on the boyfriends of other girls.
Jenna probably thought that she should have never let Katie near her boyfriend. You gotta understand that Katie had a history of taking boyfriends of her friends, taking other people's husbands. So in the end, this was really no surprise.
Jenna had been devastated. But when Mike asked her for a divorce, she refused.
Jenna didn't want to get divorced. They had just gotten married, so why would she want to get divorced? She would want to work it out.
Jenna told Mike she still loved him and that she was willing to forgive the affair with Katie.
She really wanted Mike to stay with her. She needed him to recommit to their wedding vows. She wanted the marriage to work.
Jenna's heartfelt appeal must have worked. Even though Mike had admitted feelings for Katie, he didn't want to hurt his wife. Plus, Jenna's family said Mike had other, more practical reasons for making his marriage with Jenna work.
Even though Mike had a job, he really didn't make much, and he was really counting on the money Jenna made, and the money she was getting from her grandmother. With Jenna, he could have a life and a means of support. Whereas Katie didn't have a job. She didn't have a house to live in. All Katie could offer was sex.
From all outward appearances, it seemed Mike and Katie's love affair had come to a halt, which raised the question, could Katie have been behind Jenna's disappearance?
Katie was used to leaving men. She wasn't used to anybody leaving her. So in the end, she probably became insanely jealous and just took it out on Jenna.
Also in question was the whereabouts of Jenna's husband, Mike. Jenna's grandmother wasn't sure where Mike was. She told police that the couple had started having problems again. It was their first difficulties since the couple reconciled following Mike's affair. And while the couple had been living with her since their wedding, she hadn't seen Mike around in the last few days. Since Mike was also missing, Did that mean he had been a victim of a crime too? And could his former mistress, Katie Bellflower, have come after Mike after targeting his wife, Jenna?
If Katie was upset after being dumped, there's no telling what could have happened. She could have taken out Mike and Jenna after being rejected.
To find out, detectives began the work of trying to track both Mike and Katie down. In the meantime, investigators continued to interview Jenna's family to try and figure out what might have happened to her. And they soon learned something surprising. According to her sister, Jenna was still despondent over Mike's affair with Katie Bellflower. In fact, Jenna had apparently been so devastated by Mike's betrayal that she made a surprising and perhaps telling admission.
She had considered running away.
Had Jenna been so upset with Mike's infidelity that she faked her phone message about her fight with a mysterious stranger and then burned her own car to cover up her disappearance?
Maybe she wanted to disappear, just, get away from all the drama involving Michael.
Coming up, the search for Jenna Nanetti takes a stunning turn when another young woman falls in the deadly grasp of a potential serial killer.
I'm fighting trying to get the rope off my neck. This might be the end of my life right now.
When 17-year-old Katie Bellflower and 20-year-old Mike Simons fell in love in the summer of 2002, they seemed like a perfect match. But there was just one problem.
Mike wasn't just spoken for. He was married. And after this torrid affair with Katie, Mike was going back to his wife, leaving Katie alone and heartbroken.
But Mike's homecoming hadn't lasted. Just a few months later, his wife, Jenna Nanetti, had mysteriously disappeared. The only clues to what might have happened was a disturbing phone message Jenna had made about a fight she'd been in on the night she vanished. And a surprising admission she made to her sister shortly before she disappeared.
She told her sister that she was so upset by Mike's betrayal that she was even considering running away. There was a moment there when police were wondering, is this all a setup? Had Jenna really disappeared on purpose?
Adding to the mystery of the case was the fact that Jenna's husband, Mike Simons, was also missing. But police got a break in the case when Mike finally returned the phone calls they'd left on his cell. Speaking with investigators over the phone, Mike confirmed that he'd moved out after some recent friction with Jenna. Police asked if he wouldn't mind answering a few questions. Mike agreed and gave them an address where he could be found. Detectives headed to the address, and Mike answered the door, but he wasn't alone.
We knocked at the front door of the residence. Michael and Katie emerged.
Mike was with Katie Bellflower, the same woman he was having an affair with a few months earlier.
Mike told investigators that he'd reconnected with Katie when he and Jenna began having problems again.
The house belonged to Katie's mother. He'd been staying there while things were still rough at home.
Mike and Katie both appeared shocked to learn that Jenna was missing and that her car had been set on fire. Mike told police that even through their marital problems, he and Jenna had stayed in contact, and he'd actually seen her briefly on the evening she disappeared.
Michael and Katie said that they had seen her earlier in the evening, about 9 p.m.
According to Mike, Jenna had just stopped by to make a final plea to save their marriage.
Jenna wanted them to work things out, and so she went over there, and it was just her and Michael sitting on the porch, talking.
But while that was the last time he'd seen his wife, Mike told investigators it wasn't the last time he'd heard from her.
Michael claims that he received a couple of phone calls from Jenna. One of the phone calls, Jenna indicated that she'd been in an altercation.
It was a disturbingly similar message to the voicemail Jenna had left with her grandmother, and just as vague.
She didn't say who she was fighting with, or even what the fight was about. All she said was that she had been assaulted, and then she hung up.
Was it possible the person Jenna had been fighting with had also set fire to her car? And if so, what happened to Jenna afterwards? To try and answer that question, police reached out to several of Jenna's friends.
They claim they had no idea who Jenna was fighting with during all those phone calls.
But Jenna's friends did reveal something surprising. Apparently, Jenna and Mike hadn't just been going through a rough patch. They'd been headed for divorce. And at Mike's request, all so he could be with his self-proclaimed true love, Katie Bellflower.
Apparently, Mike and Katie had never ended the affair. They just kept on seeing each other behind Jenna's back. Jenna found out when Mike called her on the phone and said, "Listen, I'm in love with Katie. I'm leaving you, and we're getting a divorce."
To police, it was a shocking revelation and suggested that if there was one person who caused Jenna more grief than any other, it was Katie Bellflower. But had Katie been the person who attacked Jenna with a bat? To police, it didn't make much sense, especially because in their battle for Mike's love, it seemed like Katie had already won.
Mike had picked Katie. He was with her, and he'd asked Jenna for a divorce. He was done with her. Katie had Mike. He was ready to leave Jenna. So Katie really had no motive to want to hurt Jenna.
That is, unless Jenna had put up a fight to keep Mike, like she had in the past.
Jenna didn't want to give up Mike the last time he wanted to leave her. She convinced him to stay. If Jenna didn't give up on Mike and wasn't going to grant him a divorce, maybe Katie's the one who decided, hell, I'll get Jenna out of the picture so I can have Mike all to myself. Maybe Katie was the woman on the phone that Jenna had been talking about. Maybe it was her who hit her with the bat.
To find out, detectives decided to have another conversation with Katie and asked her where she was on the night Jenna Nanetti disappeared. But Katie had an alibi.
Katie said she was at home all night with Mike at the time.
They essentially alibied each other out.
The fact that Mike would vouch for his girlfriend wasn't a surprise. But Katie and Mike claimed that there was someone else who could verify their whereabouts on the evening in question.
They said they were with a good friend that night, Jeff Hamilton.
Jeff Hamilton was a good friend and considered an older brother of Katie Bellflower. They were really good buddies.
When police interviewed Jeff Hamilton at his home, he confirmed that he was with Mike and Katie on the night Jenna had vanished.
Jeff had indicated that he hung out at this neighborhood park with Michael and Katie.
With both Katie and Michael seemingly eliminated as suspects, police weren't sure where to turn next. 2 weeks passed with no sign of Jenna and no new leads. Then, on October 14th, detectives received a call from police in a nearby county.
They found a pretty ravaged body.
The body was so decomposed it was impossible to identify or even determine the victim's gender. But a check of the missing persons database soon brought up a potential hit.
You look into the general data system to see if there are any missing persons. Quickly, it became evident this probably was Jenna.
Dental x-rays soon confirmed the awful truth. The decayed remains belonged to 17-year-old Jenna Nanetti. But an autopsy soon revealed that Jenna hadn't just died, she'd been murdered.
It was determined that she suffered at least 2 gunshot wounds to her torso, definitely one to the chest, and that was fatal.
What had been a missing persons case was now a homicide investigation. But detectives still had almost nothing to go on.
There are no witnesses to the murder. There are no witnesses to even indicate where Jenna was in the last few hours of her life. There's just no information at all.
To try and figure out what could have happened to Jenna, police turned to the public for help. But despite a $5,000 reward, no new leads came in. Months passed without any new developments.
That's where the investigations stalled.
But in the spring of 2003, events began to unfold that would shine a new light on the dormant case. It began in the early morning hours of March 1st in the Del Val Regional Park, about 10 miles east of Livermore. A park patrol officer was making his rounds when he approached a suspicious-looking vehicle parked alongside of the road. As the officer got closer, he could make out 3 teenagers on the ground beside the car.
As I got closer, I realized there was one person who was laying on her back and 2 people kneeling down beside her.
But it was soon clear this group of teens were up to something sinister.
I realized that the people that were kneeling down next to this person were both wearing blue latex gloves.
What are they doing to this girl? Had this cop just stumbled across a murder in progress?
Coming up, the officer tries to determine what's going on with the 3 teenagers in the park. And a witness recounts her harrowing brush with death.
My mom opened the door and she was like, "What happened?" And I was like, "They tried to kill me."
20-year-old Mike Simons had married his high school sweetheart, Jenna Nanetti, only to leave her a few months after their wedding for a seductive 17-year-old named Katie Bellflower. But this love triangle had been overshadowed by tragedy when Jenna was found murdered.
There are no witnesses to the murder. There are no witnesses to even indicate where Jenna was in the last few hours of her life.
But 5 months after Jenna's body had been found, a bizarre scene in a nearby park would send the investigation into overdrive. An officer on patrol had stumbled upon 3 teens. One was a young woman on the ground in distress, while the 2 kneeling over her, a young man and woman, were both wearing latex gloves.
Latex gloves are generally worn by doctors and people who commit murder. And these 2, they certainly weren't doctors.
The young man told the officer not to worry. He and his associate were just helping their friend who was under the weather.
He told me that the person laying on the ground was not feeling well. He thought she was going to throw up, and he didn't want to get any vomit on his hands.
It was a strange explanation, but when the officer asked the sick woman if she was able to sit up, she did.
I asked her if she was okay, and she said she was. So I released him at the time with the understanding they were going to take her home.
But before he let them go, the officer took their names and checked their IDs.
The young lady that was laying on her back, her name was Aspen Lum. The girl that was leaning over her was Katie Bellflower, and Jeffrey Hamilton was the young man.
Katie had at one time been a person of interest in the murder of Jenna Nanetti. Jeff Hamilton was one of Katie's close friends, while Aspen Lum was a 17-year-old student who went to the same school as Katie. Katie assured the officer that she and Jeff would take Aspen straight home. The officer agreed and let the teens drive away. But just minutes after they'd left, the officer received a call on his radio. Apparently, Aspen Lum's family had just called police to report their daughter was missing.
Dispatch gets a call from Aspen Lum's family that she wasn't supposed to be out, that she should have been at home.
I realized at that point that I had been lied to, and I set off to try and find them. I went north on Del Val Parkway, and a few minutes later I found the car.
The officer pulled the vehicle over, but as he approached, he noticed there were only 2 teens inside.
This time it was only occupied with Katie Bellflower and Jeffrey Hamilton.
Where was Aspen Lum? Katie told the officer that they had just dropped her off at home.
I started investigating a little further and come to realize that they had indeed dropped her off at her house.
With Aspen confirmed to be back at her home, the officer was about to let Katie and Jeff go for a second time, when dispatch suddenly notified him after they'd received an hysterical call from Aspen's parents.
My mom opened the door and she was like, "What happened?" And I was like, "They tried to kill me," and I just kind of broke down.
Aspen told her parents that she had gone with Jeff and Katie to the park that evening to drink whiskey. But then the night took an unexpected turn.
We were just kind of talking, and I don't remember what we were talking about. And then all of a sudden there was a rope around my neck.
Jeff was strangling Aspen. Terrified, Aspen tried to fight back, but Katie helped hold her down.
She was holding me down on the ground, and I was just thinking, this is gonna be the end of me.
It was a harrowing story, backed up by the injuries on Aspen's neck.
She shows them ligature marks on her neck.
The reason she didn't notify the park police at the time was she was so frightened she was basically frozen.
But why had Katie and Jeff tried to kill Aspen? Once in police custody, Katie accused Aspen of lying about the attack and suggested that Aspen was simply jealous of her relationship with Mike Simons.
And the only thing I can think of is basically her trying to get me out of the picture so she can have Mike.
Aspen was a friend of Katie's, and she knew Mike. I mean, they hung out in the same circles. Katie was convinced that Aspen was falling in love with Mike.
It was a strange explanation, but unlike Katie, when police spoke to Jeff Hamilton, he didn't deny the attack had happened. Instead, Jeff decided to step investigators through the events that had led up to the assault on Aspen Lum. According to Jeff, the night had started when Katie had called him about borrowing his car. When he asked why, the answer she gave was shocking.
She told me that yesterday morning, that is what she wanted to do, was to kill Aspen.
Jeff Hamilton reluctantly agrees to participate in the murder because they're his friends, and he wants to please his friends.
Jeff told detectives that Katie convinced Aspen to meet up that night. But when the trio arrived at the park, Katie had already told Jeff what she wanted him to do.
Katie told me that what she wanted to do is as soon as Aspen looked either drunk or actually passed out from it, then that's when she wanted me to sneak up on Aspen.
Okay, and sneak up and do what?
Strangle her.
But when Jeff had tightened the rope around Aspen's neck, the frightened teenager had fought back. So Katie helped hold her down.
Catherine Bellflower begins pulling her hands away so she can't pull the rope from around her neck.
That's about the time one of the park police officers drove up, so it was kind of a lucky thing that he showed up right then.
Detectives confronted Katie with Jeff Hamilton's incriminating confession.
That's when she decided her best interest was to tell her side of the story.
Katie told detectives it was true that she tried to kill Aspen. And the reason was because she had just learned that Aspen was cheating with her boyfriend, 20-year-old Mike Simons.
Mike took up a relationship with Aspen Lum, and at that point, I think that's when Katie began to try and find a way to get Aspen out of the picture.
Katie told investigators she wasn't about to let Mike go without a fight. And then Katie Bellflower made a startling second admission.
She said, "The only reason I tried to kill Aspen is because I got away with Jenna's murder."
She told police, "I killed Jenna and Eddie." And they were shocked.
She's confessing to a cold case murder that's nearly 6 months old.
Katie explained that when she and Mike fell in love, Jenna had been the only thing standing between them and living happily ever after.
Me and Mike were talking about it one day, and we agreed that the only way to get that drama out of our lives was to get rid of her.
Katie said Mike pointed out that if Jenna were to die, not only could they finally get married, they'd also be rich.
Jenna had a life insurance policy, and he, as her husband, would automatically benefit.
According to Katie, the policy had been worth $100,000, and the prospect of getting Jenna out of the way and money in the bank was hard to resist. So Katie and Mike began to map out their plan to get rid of her. The first step was to persuade Jeff Hamilton to be their accomplice.
Katie was very close to Jeff Hamilton. She knew she could convince him to do anything that she wanted him to do, including kill Jenna.
On the evening of October 6th, the trio set their trap.
Their plan was to have Michael Simons lure Jenna over to Katie's house to talk about their relationship.
Jenna, thinking Mike might be wanting to repair their marriage, agreed to meet him.
Once Jenna arrives at the scene, her and Michael, they're on the front porch.
They got touchy. At one point, they kissed a little bit.
That was Katie's cue to attack. Katie burst from the house and hit Jenna over the head with a baseball bat. The idea had been to knock Jenna out with the blow, but it was soon clear to Katie and Mike that their plan hadn't worked.
When she hit Jenna Nanetti, she did not knock her out. She just got Jenna pissed off.
Bleeding and disoriented, Jenna tried to attack Katie, but Mike grabbed her while Katie and Jeff retreated.
At some point, they had let each other know that the plan was still on.
Meanwhile, Mike pretended to be surprised by the attack and told Jenna he was going to get her help from inside the house. But what he really did was improvise a new way to kill Jenna Nanetti.
He tells me and Jeff that as soon as he leaves to go out to Whiskey Slough.
Whiskey Slough was a waterfront where the group knew they could dispatch Jenna without drawing too much attention.
Katie and Jeff got into a car, Jeff's car, and then drove out to the slough where they had planned to kill Jenna.
Mike was using every ounce of persuasion he had to convince Jenna that they should follow Katie and Jeff so Jenna could get even.
Mike told her that he knew where I would be hiding and that if she wanted to go beat my ass, he'd hold me for her. And she agreed to it.
Mike and Jenna arrived at Whiskey Slough moments later. Mike parked his car at the bottom of the levee and told Jenna to wait there for him.
Michael gets out of the vehicle, goes over to where Jeff Hamilton is with Catherine Bellflower.
Mike came up to Jeff's car and got the shotgun out of the trunk.
As Mike walked back, he called out to Jenna, who was still waiting patiently by the car. At first, Jenna seemed relieved Mike had returned so quickly. But then she saw the gun and began screaming and pleading for her life.
All I could hear was, Mike, please, no.
And he shoots her repeatedly with a shotgun.
To make sure she was dead, he shot her 6 times total.
Once Jenna was dead, Katie said the three then dragged Jenna's body into the field and covered her with brush.
They left in both cars, and they drove to the bar, and they set Jenna's car ablaze using road flares.
Mike's just like, well, if it's on fire, then they'll think that she might have been in it.
It was a shocking confession and gave investigators more than enough evidence to place Katie, Mike, and Jeffrey under arrest.
All 3 were charged in San Joaquin County with the murder of Jenna Nanetti.
Coming up, prosecutors bring murder charges against all 3 suspects and prepare to bring Katie and Mike to trial. But a surprise revelation leads some to wonder if police had charged the wrong couple for the crime.
Jeff basically had unrequited love for Katie Bellflower and would basically do anything that she wanted.
5 months after Jenna Nanetti's body had been found dumped in a field, her husband Mike Simons and his mistress Katie Bellflower were charged with her murder.
The plan was to knock Jenna out, kill her, dump her body, and then collect the money from her life insurance policy.
But not long after their arrest, Mike and Katie got a rude awakening. When Jenna first learned about Mike's affair with Katie, she secretly changed the beneficiary on her policy from Mike to her grandparents.
Actually, her grandparents would have been the ones to get paid out.
But that wasn't the only surprise left in store. As attorneys for both sides began trial preparations, they made a shocking discovery. Mike and Katie's passion hadn't only driven them to take a life, it seemed they had created one as well.
She was pregnant with his child.
Katie told police that she'd found out in November, after Jenna was killed. But prosecutors believed it had likely motivated the attempted murder of Aspen Love.
She was going to have the baby, she was going to have Mike, Jenna was out of the way, and then she found out that her boyfriend was seeing yet another girl.
She was carrying Michael Simmons' child. Now she was going to get dumped. She blamed Aspen Lum.
But prosecutors were worried Katie's pregnancy might elicit sympathy from the jury.
Katie Bellflower was a difficult case to try to determine Does a 17-year-old girl deserve to go away for the rest of her life? Is there redemption?
As it turned out, the jury would never hear Katie's case. With her full confession a matter of record, Katie realized there was little point in gambling on a jury's sympathy.
There was no deal with Katie Bellflower. She pled guilty to everything. And at a sentencing hearing, the judge gave her, because of her age, 25 to life in prison.
Prosecutors then turned their attention to Mike Simons. When Mike's trial began in October of 2005, his attorneys didn't contest the fact that Mike had been in on the murder plan. But they did take issue with one very important detail from Katie's statement.
Michael Simons said that Jeffrey Hamilton is the one who actually pulled the trigger.
On the surface, the defense's accusation seemed like a stretch. Jeff Hamilton didn't have a connection to Jenna, or an obvious motive for the crime. But Mike's defense team argued that Jeff would have done anything to please Katie Bellflower because of the obsessive crush he had on the 17-year-old seductress.
Jeff basically had unrequited love for Katie Bellflower and would basically do anything that she wanted.
The defense argued that Katie knew Jeff Hamilton would do anything for her. She could manipulate him into killing Jenna. The whole plan so that she could be with Mike.
But prosecutors countered by presenting the recorded testimony of the one man they believed could convince the jury that Mike was lying, Jeff Hamilton.
We had enough information from Jeffrey Hamilton to make the call that the way their story laid out matched a lot of the physical evidence that we had.
I'd say 3 to 5 minutes after he walked down there with the shotgun, I heard the first shot.
Could you see what was happening from where you were at?
I could see the muzzle flash.
It was believable that Michael Simons was actually the trigger puller.
The jury agreed and found Michael Simons guilty of murder.
He got life without parole.
With Mike and Katie both behind bars, justice seemed served. But their community of Livermore was left reeling. And many were left wondering what about their twisted relationship had fueled their bloodlust.
No matter how many times I've thought about it over the years and how many other cases I've worked, I've never seen anything so cold, callous, and violent by such young people.
On the surface, there was nothing remarkable about the house in Sacramento, California. It was a place where people came to live when they needed somewhere affordable, somewhere stable, somewhere they could remain when life had left them with few other choices. Some were elderly, some were poor, some were vulnerable and depended on others for support. And the woman who ran the boarding house presented herself as someone capable of providing exactly that kind of refuge. Her name was Dorothea Helen Puente. Born on January 9, 1929, Puente would eventually become known as the Death House Landlady, a name that would follow her long after the investigation had transformed her home into a crime scene. But in the beginning, there was no obvious reason for anyone to imagine that the house concealed anything more sinister than the ordinary difficulties of people living on the margins of society. That was precisely what made the case so disturbing. The people who disappeared were not necessarily the kind of people whose absence immediately produced alarm. They were people who could become isolated, people whose movements might not be closely watched, people whose lives could fade from the attention of the outside world. And beneath the normal appearance of the boarding house, a pattern was slowly forming. By the time investigators fully understood what they were looking at, 7 bodies would be discovered in the property's backyard. But the story did not begin with 7 graves. It began with 1 missing man, 1 concerned social worker, and a series of explanations that did not seem to fit together. In 1988, one of the people living at Puente's boarding house was Alvaro Bert Montoya, a vulnerable man who had been referred to the house by social worker Judy Moise. Montoya's connection to Moise meant that his disappearance did not go entirely unnoticed. He was expected to attend appointments, He was expected to remain in contact. And then, suddenly, he stopped appearing. For someone who depended on support and assistance, that change was significant. Moise began asking questions. She wanted to know where Montoya had gone. The answer she received from Puente did not provide the reassurance she needed. Her explanations about Montoya's whereabouts were inconsistent, and the uncertainty surrounding him became increasingly difficult to ignore. What might initially have looked like a simple disappearance began to take on another meaning. There was no certainty yet that a crime had occurred. There was no complete picture, no confirmed motive, and no evidence capable of explaining what had happened to Montoya. There was only a missing person and a growing concern that something was wrong. Police began examining the property. What they found would change the investigation completely. Investigators began digging in the backyard. At first, the act itself was almost impossible to reconcile with the ordinary purpose of the place. This was a garden behind a boarding house. It was not supposed to contain evidence of violence or hidden deaths. Yet beneath the ground, investigators discovered a body. Then another. Then another. Each discovery altered the meaning of the one before it. One body might have been an isolated tragedy. Multiple bodies in the same property demanded a different explanation. The investigation expanded, and eventually 7 bodies were recovered from the grounds of the house in November 1988. The backyard had become a physical record of people who had disappeared from the lives of those around them. The discovery raised a question that investigators could no longer avoid. How many people had died inside the orbit of Dorothea Puente? And perhaps even more importantly, how had their deaths gone unnoticed for so long? The answer would eventually lead investigators toward a theory of financial exploitation. Prosecutors would argue that Puente's motive was not fame, excitement, or notoriety, but money. Some of the people who lived at the house received government assistance or other payments. According to the prosecution, Puente could continue controlling or using those funds after a tenant had died. The alleged scheme depended upon the very vulnerability that had brought people to the house in the first place. Their isolation and dependence made them easier to exploit, and their disappearances could initially appear less suspicious than the disappearance of someone surrounded by a large family or an active social network. Among the deaths that would later become central to the prosecution were those of Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. Dorothy Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Prosecutors argued that Miller had been poisoned with medication and that Puente later used Miller's identification. Benjamin Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. Before he disappeared in April 1988, Puente reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. At trial, prosecutors presented that statement as part of the evidence surrounding his death. Leona Carpenter was another person whose death became one of the 3 murder cases ultimately proven against Puente in court. But there was an essential distinction that would remain important throughout the entire case. Investigators suspected Puente in connection with more deaths than prosecutors were ultimately able to prove. 9 people were included in the charges brought against her, but the jury convicted her of 3 murders. On the other 6 counts, the jury could not reach verdicts. That distinction matters because the discovery of 7 bodies in a single backyard created an overwhelming image. But a criminal trial requires more than suspicion. It requires evidence sufficient to establish individual criminal responsibility. Before that question could be tested in court, however, Puente made another decision that would dramatically change the investigation. After the bodies were discovered, she left Sacramento. She reportedly took approximately $3,000 with her. The woman who had been at the center of a boarding house for vulnerable residents was suddenly gone. Her departure intensified suspicion and triggered a search that eventually led investigators to Los Angeles, where Puente was arrested. By then, the ordinary image of the boarding house had disappeared. The property was no longer simply a place where vulnerable people had lived. It had become the center of an investigation into multiple deaths, financial exploitation, and 3 murders that prosecutors would eventually argue had been committed by the woman who controlled the house. Yet even after the bodies were recovered and Puente was captured, the central questions remained unresolved. Who exactly had killed each victim? How had the deaths occurred? What evidence could distinguish one suspected murder from another? And why had so many vulnerable people been able to disappear without immediate alarm? The answers would have to be assembled slowly through witnesses, financial evidence, records, and the reconstruction of lives that had ended inside or around one Sacramento boarding house. The case would not reach its final legal judgment until 1993. By then, the prosecution would have presented 156 witnesses, more than 300 exhibits, and a court record exceeding 22,000 pages. But none of those numbers could fully capture what investigators had confronted when they first looked beneath the garden. 7 bodies had been found in a place that was supposed to offer shelter. 3 murders would ultimately be proven in court. 6 additional murder charges would remain without verdicts. And behind every number was a person whose disappearance had once been someone's unanswered question. The story of Dorothea Puente was therefore not simply the story of a woman accused of killing tenants. It was the story of people who were vulnerable enough to be overlooked, and of the moment when someone finally refused to accept that a missing person had simply vanished. Before there was a courtroom, before there were verdicts, before the phrase, "death house landlady," became attached to Dorothea Puente, there was a garden in Sacramento, and beneath that garden were the first answers to a mystery that had been hiding in plain sight. Before the police began digging in the backyard, the house in Sacramento was not known as a place of death. It was a boarding house, a place where people who were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable could find somewhere to live. That context is essential to understanding what happened there, because the people connected to Dorothea Puente were not simply names that would later appear in a criminal indictment. They were people whose circumstances made them dependent on stability, and in some cases on the attention of others. Puente presented herself as someone who could provide that stability. Her home became a place where vulnerable residents could stay, and the ordinary needs of those residents helped create an environment in which disappearances could be difficult to recognize immediately. When someone living in such circumstances stopped appearing in another person's life, there could be many explanations. Perhaps they had moved, perhaps they had become ill, perhaps they had simply stopped making contact. The tragedy of the case is that these possibilities could provide time in which questions remained unanswered, and the people who should have been noticed were not always immediately searched. 4. Among the people whose lives became central to the case was Dorothy Miller. Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Her story would later become one of the 3 murders that prosecutors were able to establish. Against Puente in court, prosecutors argued that Miller had been poisoned with medication and that, after her disappearance, Puente used Miller's identification. That allegation gave investigators something more than a disappearance. It suggested that Miller's identity had continued to have value after her life had ended. The prosecution would eventually use that evidence to support the argument that financial exploitation was at the center of Puente's actions. But before the courtroom, Miller was simply another person whose whereabouts had become uncertain. Her life had not ended with a headline. It had ended with a disappearance that others had to reconstruct afterward. Benjamin Fink was another resident whose story would become critical. Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. His circumstances placed him among the people who could be particularly dependent upon the stability of a boarding house. He lived in Puente's home, and in April 1988 he disappeared. One statement attributed to Puente became important to the prosecution. She reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. The words themselves were not a confession. They did not explain what happened to Fink. But at trial, prosecutors presented the statement as part of the evidence surrounding his death. Fink's disappearance would eventually become one of the 3 murder charges on which Puente was convicted. Then there was Leona Carpenter, another victim whose death prosecutors successfully connected to Puente. The information available about Carpenter is more limited than the details preserved about Miller and Fink, but legally her importance is clear. She was one of the 3 people whose deaths resulted in murder convictions. Her name therefore belongs alongside Miller and Fink when examining what could actually be proven in court. At the same time, the case involved 6 additional alleged victims. That distinction must remain clear. The discovery of 7 bodies in the property created a powerful image, and Puente faced 9 murder charges, but the legal record did not establish that she was responsible for all 9 deaths. The jury convicted her of 3 first-degree murders and failed to reach verdicts on the other 6 counts. Suspicion and proof were not the same thing. The difference between those 2 concepts would define the eventual trial. Yet long before the jury entered the courtroom, the broader circumstances of the residents had already raised another question: why were these people so vulnerable to disappearing? The answer was not necessarily found in one individual characteristic. It was found in the conditions surrounding them. Some were elderly, some were poor, some required assistance. These circumstances could limit the number of people actively monitoring their lives. When a person lived with few resources and few connections, a change in routine could be mistaken for an ordinary change in circumstances. The boarding house could therefore provide both shelter and obscurity. People entered through its doors because they needed somewhere to live. Their personal difficulties were not secrets. Their dependence was part of everyday life. And that dependence, prosecutors later argued, was precisely what made them targets for financial exploitation. The alleged motive was money. Government assistance and other payments received by residents could continue to matter even after a tenant was no longer alive. According to the prosecution, Puente could control or use those funds. In Dorothy Miller's case, prosecutors pointed specifically to the use of Miller's identification after her disappearance. The allegation was chilling because it suggested that a person's identity could become an instrument of continued financial benefit. The supposed victim was gone, but the value attached to her name could remain. This was fundamentally different from the image of a killer seeking attention or recognition. Prosecutors portrayed Puente as someone who benefited from the continued invisibility of vulnerable people. If a tenant disappeared quietly, money could continue moving. If no one asked questions, the arrangement could remain hidden. And if the person had few people outside the boarding house watching over them, there might be no immediate pressure to explain where they had gone. That interpretation would eventually become one of the central themes of the prosecution's case. But it would be wrong to imagine that every disappearance automatically meant murder. The fact that multiple people connected to the house died was deeply suspicious. But suspicion alone could not determine how each person died. That was why the investigation became so important. Detectives had to move beyond the existence of bodies and establish what had happened to individual people. They had to separate confirmed facts from assumptions. They had to determine which deaths could be connected to Puente and which could not be proven beyond the legal standard required for conviction. In the months and years that followed, the lives of the residents would therefore become evidence. Their identities, their disappearances, their financial circumstances, and their connections to Puente would all be examined. The people who had once occupied individual rooms in a Sacramento boarding house would become the center of a homicide investigation stretching across years. Yet the most significant turning point would come from a different resident, Alvaro Bert Montoya. Unlike the earlier disappearances, Montoya's absence triggered the concern of someone outside the household who was accustomed to seeing him and noticed when he stopped appearing. Judy Moise, the social worker who had referred Montoya to Puente's boarding house, expected him to attend appointments. When he stopped coming, she began asking questions. Her concern brought attention to something that might otherwise have remained another unexplained. Absence. Puente offered explanations about where Montoya had gone, but those explanations were inconsistent. Moise became increasingly suspicious. The unanswered questions surrounding Montoya forced authorities to look more closely at the boarding house and its residents. And once investigators began examining the property, the story of the people who had disappeared could no longer remain buried in uncertainty. The garden would soon provide answers that no explanation from Puente could erase. Beneath the ground were bodies. Above the ground stood the house where vulnerable people had come looking for somewhere to live. Between those two realities was the central tragedy of the case. People who needed protection had instead become part of a mystery that took years to fully understand. Their names would eventually be repeated in police reports, courtroom testimony, and news coverage. But behind those records were lives that had existed before anyone called them victims. Dorothy Miller was a veteran. Benjamin Fink was a man struggling with alcoholism. Leona Carpenter was another resident whose death would ultimately be proven as murder. And Alvaro Montoya was a vulnerable man whose unexplained absence finally prompted someone to insist that his disappearance mattered. That insistence would lead investigators into the backyard. What they found there would transform the case from a collection of troubling disappearances into one of Sacramento's most notorious homicide investigations. By 1988, the questions surrounding Dorothea Puente's boarding house had begun to move beyond the ordinary uncertainties that could accompany vulnerable residents. The people connected to the house had already included individuals whose circumstances made them dependent on stable housing and outside assistance. But the disappearance of Alvaro Bert Montoya created a different kind of concern because someone outside the household noticed that he was no longer where he was expected to be. Montoya was a vulnerable man who had been referred to Puente's boarding house by social worker Judy Moise. The arrangement was intended to provide him with somewhere to live, but his connection with Moise also meant that his absence could be measured against a routine. He was expected to attend appointments. He was expected to remain in contact. Then he stopped appearing. At first, there was no complete explanation for what had happened. A person can miss an appointment for many reasons, especially when that person is already living under difficult circumstances. But as the absences continued, concern grew. Moise began looking for an explanation, and eventually her questions brought her back to the boarding house. The answers she received from Puente did not resolve the matter. Instead, Puente gave explanations about Montoya's whereabouts that were inconsistent. The more Moise questioned the situation, the less satisfactory those explanations became. What had begun as concern for one missing person was turning into suspicion. This was the point at which the case began to change direction. The disappearance of Montoya forced attention onto the place where he had been living. Rather than treating his absence as an isolated event, authorities began examining the boarding house itself. That examination would reveal something far more disturbing than anyone had initially expected. Investigators began searching the property. Their attention eventually turned to the backyard, an ordinary part of a residential property that would soon become the center of the investigation. Then they began digging. The first body was discovered beneath the ground. The discovery immediately transformed the nature of the case. A missing person investigation had become a death investigation. But the discovery of one body did not explain the entire situation. Investigators continued examining the property, and another body was found, then another. Each discovery made it harder to regard what had happened as an isolated tragedy. The number of bodies suggested that the history of the property had to be reconsidered. People who had lived there, people whose disappearances might once have been explained away, were now being considered in a completely different light. By November 1988, investigators had recovered 7 bodies from the grounds of the house. 7 people had been buried beneath the property. The discovery was devastating not simply because of the number, but because of what it meant about the people who had lived there. The boarding house had been presented as a place where vulnerable residents could find shelter. Now its backyard had become the site of a homicide investigation involving multiple deaths. The contrast was stark. Above ground was the ordinary world of rooms, tenants, routines, and daily life. Below ground were the remains of people whose disappearances had not been fully understood. Investigators now had to determine who the victims were, when they had died, and whether their deaths could be connected to the woman who controlled the property. The investigation could not simply assume that every body represented a murder committed by Puente. That distinction would become crucial later. At the time, however, the sheer number of bodies created an obvious and urgent question. What had happened inside this house? The answer would not be found in the bodies alone. Investigators also had to examine the circumstances surrounding the residents who had disappeared. Their lives had to be reconstructed. Their identities had to be confirmed. Their connections to Puente had to be established. Their financial circumstances had to be examined. The investigation was becoming a process of rebuilding the stories of people whose final days had become unclear. Among those stories was that of Dorothy Miller, whose disappearance dated back to October 1987. Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. Prosecutors would later argue that she had been poisoned with medication and that Puente used. Miller's identification after her disappearance. Benjamin Fink, 55, had struggled with alcoholism and had lived at the boarding house. He disappeared in April 1988. A statement attributed to Puente before his disappearance would later become evidence at trial. She had reportedly said that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. The phrase was ambiguous by itself, but prosecutors later presented it as part of the circumstances surrounding Fink's death. Leona Carpenter was another person whose death would ultimately be linked to Puente through a murder conviction. Yet the investigation involved more than these three individuals. 9 people were ultimately charged as alleged victims in the prosecution's case. The fact that 7 bodies were found at the property created a powerful physical connection between the house and the deaths. But prosecutors still faced the difficult task of proving individual murders. This is where the case became more complicated than the discovery of the graves might suggest. A body establishes that someone died. It does not automatically establish who killed that person, how the death occurred, or why. Investigators had to separate those questions carefully. They had to build a case that could survive scrutiny in court. The financial circumstances of the residents became increasingly important. Prosecutors would argue that Puente's motive was financial exploitation. Some residents received government assistance or other payments, and the prosecution argued that Puente could continue controlling or using those funds after a tenant's death. This theory gave the investigation a possible explanation for why vulnerable people had been targeted. It also provided a way to connect individual disappearances to a broader pattern. The alleged motive was not simply that people died in the same house. It was that their deaths could provide a financial benefit to the person running that house. The use of Dorothy Miller's identification became particularly significant to that theory. Prosecutors argued that Puente had used Miller's identity after her disappearance to obtain medical services. If established, that evidence suggested that Miller's identity retained practical value after her death. It also reinforced the prosecution's argument that financial exploitation was central to the case. But while investigators were building this picture, Puente was no longer simply a resident of the house under investigation. After the discovery of the bodies, she left Sacramento. She reportedly took approximately $3,000 with her. Her departure immediately became another major development in the investigation. Authorities now had a woman connected to a property containing multiple bodies who had left the area. After those discoveries, her disappearance turned the investigation into a search for a suspect. Puente was eventually located and arrested in Los Angeles. The arrest brought one phase of the case to an end, but it did not answer the most important questions. Investigators had found the bodies. They had identified a possible financial motive. They had examined disappearances involving vulnerable residents. They had watched Puente leave Sacramento and later found her in Los Angeles. But none of those facts, taken individually, could establish guilt for every death associated with the property. The investigation now had to become more precise. Which deaths could be proved? What evidence connected Puente to each individual victim? Which circumstances supported the prosecution's theory, and which remained uncertain? Those questions would eventually determine the difference between the 9 murder allegations and the 3 convictions that followed. The discovery in the backyard had exposed a hidden history, but it had not yet written the final version of that history. The people buried there had lives, names, and circumstances that needed to be understood, and the woman who had run the boarding house now faced the possibility that those lives would become evidence against her. For Judy Moise, the story had begun with a missing man who stopped attending appointments. For investigators, it had expanded into a property containing 7 bodies. For prosecutors, it would eventually become a case involving financial exploitation and multiple alleged murders. But for the victims, there was a simpler truth beneath all the legal arguments. They had disappeared, and someone had finally noticed. That was the beginning of the investigation. The next step would be to determine whether the evidence could show not merely that people had died, but that Dorothea Puente was responsible for their deaths. Once Dorothea Puente had been arrested in Los Angeles, the investigation entered a different phase. The bodies had been found. The missing residents could no longer be dismissed as people who had simply moved away. But finding bodies and arresting the person who had controlled the house were only the beginning. Investigators and prosecutors still had to establish what had happened to individual victims and why. Those victims might have been targeted. The answer they pursued was financial. According to the prosecution, money was at the center of Puente's relationship with the people who lived in her boarding house. Many of the residents were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable. Some received government assistance or other payments. Prosecutors argued that these payments created an opportunity for Puente to benefit after a tenant had died. The theory was simple in outline, but difficult to prove in individual cases. If a resident disappeared, Puente could potentially continue controlling or using money that had been intended for that person. The circumstances of the residents therefore became as important as the physical evidence recovered from the property. Investigators needed to understand not only who had died, but also what remained connected to each person after death. Their names, their identification, their financial support, and their relationship with Puente all became part of the emerging picture. The case involving Dorothy Miller became particularly important. Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987, months before the discovery of the bodies in Puente's backyard. Prosecutors later argued that Miller had been poisoned with medication. They also presented evidence that Puente used Miller's identification after her disappearance. That evidence was significant because it suggested that Miller's identity continued to serve a purpose after she was gone. To prosecutors, this supported the broader theory that Puente's actions were connected to financial exploitation. The alleged motive was not about recognition. It was not about creating fear or gaining public attention. It was about the continued value that could be extracted from people who were no longer alive to protect themselves. In that theory, the vulnerability of the tenants was not incidental. It was central. The people who came to Puente's boarding house needed somewhere to live. Some had limited resources and limited support. Their circumstances could make them dependent upon the person controlling their housing. If a resident disappeared, the absence might not immediately trigger the same response that it would have for someone surrounded by family and friends. A disappearance could be interpreted as a move, a change in circumstances, or simply a loss of contact. That possibility gave the alleged scheme an especially disturbing quality. The less visible a person was in the wider community, the easier it could be for questions about that person to remain unanswered. Benjamin Fink represented another part of the prosecution's case. Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived at Puente's boarding house and disappeared in April 1988. before his disappearance, Puente reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. At trial, prosecutors would use that statement as part of the evidence surrounding his death. The words were not presented as a direct admission of murder, but they became significant when considered alongside the disappearance and the evidence discovered during the investigation. For prosecutors, the statement helped place Puente directly in the circumstances surrounding Fink's final known period at the house. The investigation also centered on Leona Carpenter, whose death became the third murder that prosecutors were ultimately able to prove against Puente. Together, Miller, Fink, and Carpenter formed the core of the case that would eventually result in 3 first-degree murder convictions. But the investigation had uncovered more than 3 deaths associated with the property. 9 people were ultimately included as alleged victims in the prosecution. The existence of those additional cases created a difficult problem. Investigators could suspect that the deaths were connected, but a suspicion about a pattern was not enough to establish responsibility for every individual death. Each victim required evidence capable of surviving the scrutiny of a courtroom. That distinction became especially important because the physical discovery at the house was so overwhelming. 7 bodies had been recovered from the grounds. The number alone could create an impression that all of the deaths had one explanation. But criminal law does not work through impressions. Prosecutors needed to demonstrate responsibility for specific murders. The investigation, therefore, became an exercise in separating what appeared connected from what could actually be proven. The financial evidence provided one possible thread running through the case. If Puente had a reason to control the residents' money, then investigators could examine whether that motive appeared in individual cases. The use of Miller's identification was particularly important because it provided a concrete example of the prosecution's theory. It suggested that the identity of a deceased tenant could continue to produce benefits. That was not simply a question about money. It was also a question about how the victim's existence had been treated. Miller had been a person with her own life and history. Prosecutors argued that after her disappearance, her identity became something Puente could use for her own purposes. This transformed the alleged motive from an abstract financial theory into a specific allegation, connected to an individual victim. As investigators continued reconstructing the circumstances surrounding the deaths, Puente herself made a decision that would further alter the case. After the discovery of the bodies, she fled Sacramento. She reportedly took approximately $3,000 with her. Her departure did not establish guilt by itself, but it had an obvious effect on the investigation. The woman at the center of the boarding house was now absent at precisely the moment when investigators were discovering multiple bodies on the property. Authorities began searching for her, and the investigation expanded beyond Sacramento. Puente was eventually arrested in Los Angeles. The arrest meant that investigators could now focus on preparing the evidence for prosecution rather than simply trying to locate the person who had run the house. But even with Puente in custody, the hardest work remained. The prosecution would have to explain the deaths in a way that connected individual victims to individual acts. It would have to show the jury why 3 cases met the standard for conviction while the others remained less certain. The evidence would come from witnesses, financial circumstances, the identities of the victims, and the circumstances surrounding their disappearances. None of these elements could be considered in isolation. Together, prosecutors would argue they revealed a pattern of exploitation that ended in murder. The defense, however, would have the opportunity to challenge that interpretation. The existence of a pattern did not automatically prove that every death had been caused by Puente. The presence of bodies on her property did not by itself establish who had killed them, and a suspected financial motive could not substitute for proof. Those distinctions would become central when the case finally reached court. The investigation had therefore moved from the shock of discovery toward the slower, more demanding process of building a legal case. The backyard had provided the most dramatic evidence, but the courtroom would require something more precise. Prosecutors had to transform a collection of deaths into individual murder charges. They had to demonstrate that Dorothy Puente was not merely the woman who owned the property where people had died, but the person responsible for the deaths that they alleged she had caused. By the time the case approached trial, the prosecution had assembled an enormous amount of material. Hundreds of witnesses and thousands of exhibits would eventually be presented. Yet the central question remained remarkably focused. What could be proven beyond the suspicion created by 7 bodies in one backyard? The answer would come in 1993, when Dorothea Puente finally stood trial. There, the prosecution would attempt to turn years of disappearances, financial evidence, witness accounts, and the discoveries beneath the garden into a case for murder. And the outcome would reveal an important distinction between what investigators suspected and what 12 jurors could legally conclude. By 1993, the case against Dorothea Puente had grown far beyond the discovery that had first brought investigators into her Sacramento boarding house. What had begun with the disappearance of Alvaro Bert Montoya and the questions raised by social worker Judy Moise had developed into a major homicide prosecution. 7 bodies had been recovered from the property. 9 people were ultimately included as alleged victims in the case. And Puente, after leaving Sacramento with approximately $3,000, had been arrested in Los Angeles. Now the questions that had occupied investigators would have to be answered in a courtroom. The trial would test not simply whether people had died at or around Puente's boarding house, but whether the prosecution could prove that she had deliberately killed them. The proceedings began in 1993 and became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Sacramento. The scale of the trial reflected the complexity of the investigation. 156 witnesses would testify. More than 3,100 exhibits would be introduced into evidence. The court record would eventually exceed 22,000 pages. Those numbers reveal how much information the jury had to consider, but they also underline the central difficulty of the case. The prosecution had to transform a large collection of circumstances into proof of individual murders. The prosecution presented a theory in which financial exploitation was the central motive. Puente's boarding house was occupied by people who were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable. Some received government assistance or other payments. Prosecutors argued that Puente could benefit financially when those residents died because she could continue controlling or using their funds. The case involving Dorothy Miller became an important part of that argument. Miller was 64 and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Prosecutors argued that she had been poisoned with medication and that Puente later used Miller's identification. In the prosecution's interpretation, Miller's identity had retained value even after her death. That allegation connected the circumstances of her death to the broader financial theory surrounding the boarding house. The prosecution also presented evidence concerning Benjamin Fink. Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived at Puente's house and disappeared in April 1988. Before his disappearance, Puente reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. Prosecutors argued that the statement was significant when considered alongside the circumstances of Fink's disappearance and death. It placed Puente in the immediate context of what would become one of the 3 murder cases ultimately proven against her. Leona Carpenter was the 3rd victim whose death resulted in a murder conviction. Together, Miller, Fink, and Carpenter became the 3 cases in which the jury ultimately found Puente guilty of first-degree murder. But the prosecution had brought more than 3 allegations. 6 additional murder counts remained unresolved. This distinction was crucial. The evidence surrounding the boarding house could create a powerful impression of a common pattern. But the jury still had to decide whether the prosecution had established guilt in each individual case. A criminal trial is not decided simply by the number of bodies found or by the disturbing circumstances surrounding a defendant. Each charge must be evaluated on its own evidence. That meant the jury had to examine the prosecution's allegations victim by victim, The financial theory might explain a possible motive, but motive alone could not establish murder. A suspicious disappearance might raise questions, but suspicion alone could not produce a conviction. The prosecution therefore relied on the accumulated evidence presented throughout the lengthy proceedings. Witness testimony became an important part of that process. The statement attributed to Puente regarding Fink was considered alongside other evidence. The circumstances involving Miller's identification were used to support the financial exploitation theory. The history of vulnerable residents and their disappearances helped prosecutors argue that the deaths were not isolated events. Yet the defense had the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of those circumstances. The fact that multiple people connected to the boarding house had died did not automatically establish that Puente had killed every one of them. Nor did the discovery of 7 bodies by itself answer how each person had died. The jury therefore faced a difficult task, determining where the evidence crossed the line from suspicion to proof. The proceedings continued through an enormous amount of testimony and documentary evidence. 156 witnesses contributed to the record, while thousands of exhibits gave the jury material to examine. The case required the jurors to consider events that had taken place across years rather than during one clearly defined incident. The victims had disappeared at different times. Their circumstances differed. The evidence supporting one allegation was not necessarily identical to the evidence supporting another. The jury ultimately had to separate the individual cases from the broader narrative. After weeks of deliberation, the verdicts began to establish that distinction. Puente was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. These were the deaths for which the jury found the prosecution's evidence sufficient to establish her criminal responsibility. But on the other 6 murder counts, the jury could not reach verdicts. The result was therefore neither a complete rejection nor a complete acceptance of the prosecution's broader theory. 3 murders had been proven to the satisfaction of the jury. 6 additional allegations remain without verdicts. That outcome is one of the most important facts in the entire case. It would be easy, when describing the discovery of 7 bodies and the 9 murder charges, to reduce the story to a simple claim that Puente killed 9 people. But that is not what the trial established. The legal record was more limited. Puente was convicted of 3 first-degree murders. The other 6 counts ended without a verdict because the jury could not reach agreement. That difference between suspicion, accusation, and conviction would remain central to the case long after the trial ended. The sentencing phase brought another question. What punishment should Puente receive? Because she had been convicted of 3 first-degree murders, prosecutors sought the most severe possible consequence. But the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on the death penalty. That deadlock meant Puente would not be sentenced to death. Instead, on December 10, 1993, she received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence formally ended the criminal proceedings that had begun with the investigation into the Sacramento boarding house. But it did not resolve every question raised by the case. 3 families or sets of loved ones had received a legal answer in the form of murder convictions. But the 6 other allegations remained unresolved in the courtroom. The bodies, the disappearances, the financial evidence, the witness testimony, and the circumstances surrounding the boarding house had produced a complicated verdict rather than a simple one. Puente was legally responsible for 3 murders. She was not convicted of the 6 remaining charges. The difference mattered because the case had already become larger than the woman at its center. It had become a story about vulnerable people who were difficult to track. A boarding house where residents could disappear without immediate explanation, and a system that had to reconstruct their lives after they were gone. The verdict could establish responsibility for 3 deaths, but it could not restore those lives. Dorothy Miller remained a veteran whose final years had ended in circumstances that prosecutors described as murder. Benjamin Fink remained a man whose struggle with alcoholism had placed him among the vulnerable. residents of the boarding house, and whose disappearance became one of the convictions against Puente. Leona Carpenter became the third murder proven at trial. Their names were no longer simply names connected to a missing person investigation. They were victims recognized by a court as having been murdered by the woman who ran the house. And yet the 6 unresolved counts remained a reminder of the limits of what the prosecution had been able to prove. In the end, the trial did not produce a complete explanation for every death associated with the property. It produced 3 convictions, 6 unresolved allegations, and a life sentence without parole. For Puente, the legal question of her freedom was settled. For the victims, however, there was no equivalent closure. The courtroom could assign responsibility where the evidence met the required standard, but it could not erase the uncertainty surrounding the other deaths. The story that had begun beneath a Sacramento garden had reached its legal conclusion. But the deeper questions remained. How had so many vulnerable people become invisible? How had their disappearances gone unnoticed? And what could be learned from a case in which the victim's vulnerability may have been the very thing that allowed the tragedy to continue? Those questions would become the final legacy of the Dorothea Puente case. The courtroom had delivered its judgment, but the story of Dorothea Puente did not end with the verdict. On December 10, 1993, Puente was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole after the jury convicted her of 3 first-degree murders and deadlocked over the death penalty. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but the questions surrounding the Sacramento boarding house remained. 3 people had been legally established as murder victims of Puente: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. 6 other murder charges had ended without verdicts. That distinction would remain essential to any honest account of the case. The evidence had been sufficient for 3 convictions, but the jury had not been able to reach a decision on the remaining allegations. The law had drawn a line between what could be proven and what could only be suspected. For the victims and the people who cared about them, however, the distinction could never make the loss less real. The most unsettling aspect of the case was not simply the number of bodies discovered beneath the property. It was the environment in which those deaths had occurred. The boarding house was supposed to be a place where people who needed affordable housing could find stability. Many of the residents were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable. They were people who needed assistance and, in some cases, depended upon the people around them. That vulnerability was central to the prosecution's theory. Prosecutors argued that Puente exploited residents financially, using their government assistance and other payments as a source of personal benefit. The alleged motive, therefore, did not depend upon notoriety or public attention. It depended upon the ability to profit from people whose lives were already difficult. That element of the case forces attention away from the sensational image of a death house and toward the people who lived there. The victims were not simply figures in a notorious crime story. Dorothy Miller was a 64-year-old veteran. Benjamin Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. Leona Carpenter was another resident whose death was ultimately proven to be murder. Alvaro Bert Montoya was a vulnerable man whose disappearance became the catalyst for the investigation after social worker Judy Moise noticed that he had stopped attending appointments. Each person had circumstances that made them vulnerable in different ways. Their common connection was not that they had chosen to become part of a criminal case. They were simply people who had come to a boarding house looking for somewhere to live. That is what makes the case so disturbing. The danger did not announce itself as danger. The place was not presented as a trap. It was presented as a home. The people living there were not necessarily looking for excitement or risk. They were looking for ordinary things: housing, stability, and a place where they could continue their lives. The eventual discovery of 7 bodies in the backyard showed how dramatically that expectation had been violated. The case also raises difficult questions about invisibility. When someone who is isolated disappears, how quickly does the outside world notice? When an elderly or vulnerable person stops appearing in public, Who is responsible for asking where they went? When a person has few family members or close friends, how long can their absence be explained away before it becomes an emergency? There is no single answer to these questions, but the Puente case demonstrates the consequences of failing to notice. The investigation began because Judy Moise did notice. Montoya had been referred to Puente's house by Moise, and she expected him to continue attending appointments. When he stopped appearing, she did not simply accept the uncertainty. She asked questions. Puente's explanations about Montoya's whereabouts were inconsistent, and Moise's concern eventually helped bring authorities to the property. That chain of events is important because it shows that the investigation did not begin within anonymous discovery in the backyard. It began with attention to one missing person. Someone noticed that a vulnerable man was no longer where he was supposed to be. Someone questioned the explanation. Someone refused to let the disappearance disappear into the background. From that point, the investigation exposed a much larger tragedy. The garden became the physical symbol of the case, but it was not the beginning of the victims' stories. Their stories began long before their deaths. The garden simply revealed what had happened to them. In that sense, the most important lesson of the case is not about the macabre image of graves beneath a residence. It is about the conditions that allowed people to become overlooked. Vulnerability can take many forms. Age, poverty, addiction, isolation, and dependence can all make it harder for a person to protect themselves or to maintain a strong network of people watching over their well-being. When those protections are weak, another person's control can become dangerously important. The prosecution argued that Puente understood and exploited that imbalance. The conviction of 3 first-degree murders established that she had used that environment to kill at least 3 residents. But the unresolved 6 charges remind us that even in a case with overwhelming circumstances, the truth is not always complete. A responsible account cannot turn an accusation into a conviction simply because the accusation fits the larger story. 6 murder counts ended without verdicts. That does not mean the deaths were unimportant. It means the legal system could not reach the required conclusion on those particular allegations. The distinction protects the integrity of the record and, ultimately, the dignity of the victims themselves. Their stories deserve accuracy rather than exaggeration. Dorothea Puente remained in prison after her conviction and died there on March 27, 2011. Her death ended her life, but it did not erase the questions that had surrounded her case for decades. The boarding house had become notorious, but the deeper issue was never the building itself. It was the relationship between vulnerability and trust. People had entered the house because they needed help. They trusted the person providing the housing. According to the prosecution, that trust was turned into an opportunity for exploitation and murder. The case therefore stands as a warning about what can happen when the people most in need of protection are also the people least likely to be noticed when something goes wrong. The phrase "death house landlady" may be memorable, but it can also obscure the human reality of the case if it becomes the only thing remembered. The victims were more than occupants of a notorious house. They were individuals who had lives before they became evidence. They had identities before investigators recovered their remains. And their deaths mattered because they were human beings, not because their story became famous. The most haunting image is still the simplest one: an ordinary house in Sacramento, a backyard, and beneath the soil, the remains of people who had once lived there. For years, the surface gave no clear indication of what lay below. That image captures the central tragedy of the case. What looked ordinary could conceal something terrible. But perhaps the greater lesson is that ordinary lives can also become invisible unless someone is willing to notice when they disappear. The investigation began when one person asked where Alvaro Bert Montoya had gone. That question opened the door to a much larger investigation. It led authorities to the property, to the backyard, to 7 bodies, and eventually to a courtroom where Puente was convicted of 3 murders. It also demonstrated the difference between suspicion and proof. 6 additional allegations remained unresolved, and no responsible retelling should erase that distinction. In the end, the story of Dorothea Puente is not only the story of a woman who was convicted of murder. It is the story of people whose vulnerability made them easier to overlook, and of the importance of recognizing when someone has disappeared from the routines of ordinary life. The house is gone from the present tense of the story, but the questions remain. Who notices when a vulnerable person stops appearing? Who asks when an explanation does not make sense? And how much can remain hidden when no one is looking closely? In Sacramento, those questions were answered too late for the victims. But the moment Judy Moise refused to accept that Montoya had simply vanished, the silence began to break. Beneath the garden were the dead. Above it stood the evidence of a life that had looked ordinary. And between those two worlds was the lesson the case left behind. Sometimes the first step toward justice is simply refusing to stop asking where someone went. By the time Dorothea Puente died in prison on March 27, 2011, more than 2 decades had passed since investigators first uncovered the bodies beneath the backyard of her Sacramento boarding house. The distance of time did not change the basic facts of the case. Puente had been convicted of 3 first-degree murders: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. She had been sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. 6 other murder charges had ended without verdicts because the jury could not reach a decision. Those facts form the boundary between what the investigation suspected, what prosecutors alleged, and what the court ultimately established. Beyond that boundary are questions that the case never completely answered. The most obvious question concerns the 6 unresolved deaths. The prosecution had brought 9 murder allegations against Puente, but the jury convicted her on only 3. That does not transform the remaining 6 allegations into proven murders by Puente. It also does not make those deaths irrelevant. They remain part of the investigation and part of the history surrounding the boarding house. But the legal process stopped short of assigning responsibility for them. That distinction is uncomfortable because the discovery of multiple bodies creates a powerful desire for a single explanation. People naturally look for a pattern. When several vulnerable residents connected to the same property die, it is tempting to place every death into one narrative. But a criminal courtroom demands something more precise. It asks whether the evidence establishes the defendant's responsibility for a particular offense. In Puente's case, the jury answered yes in 3 instances and could not reach a verdict in 6 others. That result should not be blurred. The 3 convictions were not symbolic. They were legal findings that Puente was responsible for the murders of Miller, Fink, and Carpenter. But the 6 unresolved allegations remained unresolved. The case therefore leaves behind an unusual tension. There was enough evidence to imprison Puente for the rest of her life. Yet the full story of every person whose death became connected to the investigation could not be established in court. That tension is part of what makes the case difficult to summarize honestly. A simple label can never contain all of it. Calling Puente a murderer is legally accurate because she was convicted of 3 murders. Saying that she was convicted of killing all 9 alleged victims would be inaccurate. The difference matters, especially when the victims themselves are considered. Their story should not be reduced to a number chosen for dramatic effect. Dorothy Miller was 64 and a veteran. Her disappearance in October 1987 became one of the cases prosecutors successfully proved. The prosecution argued that she had been poisoned with medication and that Puente later used. Miller's identification. That evidence also became part of the prosecution's broader argument that financial exploitation was a motive. Benjamin Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived in the boarding house and disappeared in April 1988. The statement attributed to Puente, that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable, became part of the evidence presented at trial. His death became the 2nd murder conviction. Leona Carpenter became the 3rd. Their names are important because they prevent the case from becoming only a story about a notorious Landlady. They remind us that the people at the center of the case were the residents who lost their lives. Then there was Alvaro Bert Montoya, whose disappearance helped expose what was happening. Montoya was a vulnerable man referred to Puente's boarding house by social worker Judy Moise. When he stopped attending appointments, Moise noticed. She asked where he was. Puente's explanations were inconsistent. That simple sequence, absence, concern, questions, became the beginning of the investigation that eventually led authorities into the backyard. Without Montoya's disappearance being taken seriously, the investigation might not have developed in the same way. The discovery of the bodies then forced investigators to look backward. They had to reconsider the residents who had disappeared and examine the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The boarding house was no longer simply a place where vulnerable people had lived. It was now evidence. The garden was no longer simply part of the property. It had become the place where investigators recovered 7 bodies in November 1988. And Puente was no longer simply the woman who managed the house. She had become the central suspect in an investigation that would eventually produce one of Sacramento's most significant homicide trials. The investigation also revealed the importance of financial circumstances. Prosecutors argued that Puente's motive was economic. Some of the residents received government assistance or other payments, and the prosecution argued that Puente could continue controlling or using those funds after the residents died. The allegation concerning Miller's identification was particularly important because it demonstrated how, according to prosecutors, the identity of a deceased tenant could continue to have practical value. This theory placed financial exploitation at the heart of the case. It also offered an explanation for why people who were already vulnerable might have been targeted. The alleged motive was not based on fame. It was not based on a desire to become known. It was based on the possibility of financial benefit. That distinction is important because it shifts attention from the personality of the accused to the circumstances of the victims. People who needed affordable housing had placed themselves in an environment where another person controlled the property. Some were elderly, some were poor, some had personal difficulties. Those circumstances did not make them responsible for what happened to them. They made the need for protection more important. The case therefore raises a broader question about how society notices vulnerable people. When someone with a strong family network disappears, the absence may immediately generate calls, searches, and questions. When someone lives alone, has few resources, or depends upon others, the same disappearance may not receive the same immediate attention. In the Puente case, the first crucial question came from a social worker who knew that Montoya was supposed to be somewhere else. Judy Moise noticed that he was missing from a routine that mattered. Her concern challenged the assumption that there might be an ordinary explanation. That is an important lesson from the case, because investigations often begin not with a dramatic discovery, but with someone noticing that something does not make sense. The backyard excavation came later. The courtroom came later. The conviction came later. The first step was a question: where was he? That question ultimately led to another. What had happened to the people who had lived at the house before him? The answers were devastating. 7 bodies were recovered from the property. 9 people were included in the murder prosecution. 3 murders were proven. 6 charges remained without verdicts. Puente fled Sacramento after the discovery of the bodies, carrying approximately $3,000, and was eventually arrested in Los Angeles. In 1993, 156 witnesses testified, more than 100 exhibits were introduced, and the court record exceeded 22,000 pages. The sheer size of the trial reflected the difficulty of reconstructing what had happened. Yet after all of that evidence, the final legal answer remained limited. 3 convictions, life without parole, no death sentence because the jury deadlocked over that punishment, and 6 murder allegations without a verdict. That may feel incomplete, but incompleteness is sometimes part of the historical record. A responsible true crime story cannot manufacture certainty where the court did not find it. The victims deserve better than that. They deserve to be remembered accurately. The case also leaves behind a warning about the danger of confusing appearances with reality. A boarding house can look ordinary. A landlord can appear helpful. A resident can disappear without immediate explanation. A financial transaction can look routine. None of those things, considered alone, necessarily reveals a crime. It is the accumulation of unanswered questions that eventually changes the picture. In Sacramento, those questions accumulated until the ground itself provided an answer. Dorothea Puente's story ended in prison, but the victim's stories should not end with her name. Their lives existed before the investigation. Their vulnerabilities were not their identities. Their deaths were not merely evidence. They were losses suffered by human beings whose circumstances placed them in a position where they could be overlooked. That may be the most enduring lesson of the case. The horror was not only that bodies were hidden beneath a garden. It was that the people buried there had become difficult for the outside world to see. The investigation began when someone refused to accept that one vulnerable man had simply disappeared. That decision broke through the silence surrounding the house. It led to the discovery of 7 bodies, to an enormous investigation, and ultimately to 3 murder convictions. But it could not answer every question. Some questions remained buried with the dead. And perhaps that is where the story should end, not with a sensational image of a notorious criminal, but with the names of the people whose lives made the investigation necessary. Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, Leona Carpenter, Alvaro Bert Montoya. They were not simply residents of a house that became famous. They were people whose absence eventually became impossible to ignore. In the end, the most important act was not the arrest, the trial, or the sentence. It was the moment someone noticed that a person was missing and decided that the explanation did not make sense. Sometimes justice begins there, with a question that refuses to disappear. There are criminal cases that remain disturbing because of what investigators discover, and there are cases that remain disturbing because of what those discoveries reveal about the people who were never noticed in time. The case of Dorothea Puente belongs to both categories. In November 1988, investigators searching the backyard of her Sacramento boarding house uncovered 7 bodies. The discovery transformed an ordinary residential property into the center of a major homicide investigation. But the deeper significance of the case was not simply that bodies had been hidden beneath the ground. It was that the people beneath that ground had once lived among others, had depended upon a place to stay, and had eventually disappeared from the routines of the people around them. Their absence did not immediately produce answers. It took one person's concern, followed by an investigation, to expose what had been hidden. At the center of that turning point was Alvaro Bert Montoya. Montoya was a vulnerable man who had been referred to Puente's boarding house by social worker Judy Moise. He was expected to attend appointments. Then he stopped appearing. Moise noticed. She asked questions. Puente offered explanations about Montoya's whereabouts, but those explanations were inconsistent. That inconsistency pushed the situation beyond an ordinary missed appointment. It created a reason to look more closely. The investigation that followed eventually led authorities into the backyard, where the first body was found. Then another. Then another. 7 bodies were ultimately recovered from the property. In retrospect, the discoveries seemed to change the meaning of everything that had happened there. A boarding house for vulnerable residents had become the setting of a mystery involving multiple deaths. But even then, investigators could not simply assume that every death had the same explanation. That distinction would remain important throughout the case. 9 people were ultimately included as alleged victims in the prosecution. Yet in 1993, after an enormous trial, the jury convicted Puente of 3 first-degree murders: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. On the other 6 counts, the jury could not reach verdicts. The legal record, therefore, tells a more precise story than the popular image of the case might. suggest. Puente was a convicted murderer, but she was not convicted of all 9 alleged murders. 3 deaths were established to the satisfaction of the jury. 6 allegations remained unresolved. That difference should never be lost beneath the weight of the case's notoriety. Dorothy Miller's name is central to that distinction. Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Prosecutors argued that Puente poisoned her with medication and later used Miller's identification. The prosecution presented that evidence as part of a broader theory that financial exploitation was the motive. According to that theory, Puente targeted people whose circumstances made them vulnerable and benefited from government assistance or other payments connected to them. Miller's identification was especially significant because prosecutors argued that Puente used it to obtain medical services after Miller's disappearance. The allegation suggested that the value of Miller's identity continued even after her life had ended. Benjamin Fink represented another part of the prosecution's case. Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived at the boarding house and disappeared in April 1988. Before his disappearance, Puente reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. Prosecutors presented that statement as part of the evidence surrounding his death. Leona Carpenter became the 3rd victim whose death was legally attributed to Puente. Their cases formed the foundation of the convictions that eventually resulted in a sentence of life without parole. Yet the 6 unresolved charges remain an essential part of the historical record. The jury did not agree on them. That means the complete story of those deaths cannot honestly be presented as settled fact. This is one of the most important lessons of true crime itself. A compelling narrative must never become more certain than the evidence allows. The discovery of 7 bodies creates an image that is almost impossible to ignore. The existence of multiple deaths at the same property naturally suggests a pattern. But a pattern is not automatically proof of every individual act. Prosecutors had to establish responsibility for specific murders, and the jury ultimately found that the evidence met that standard in 3 cases. In the other 6, it did not produce a unanimous verdict. That boundary between suspicion and proof is part of what makes the case so important. It demonstrates how an investigation can reveal a horrifying pattern while the courtroom still demands careful distinctions. The trial itself showed the enormous effort required to reconstruct what had happened. 156 witnesses testified. More than 3,100 exhibits were introduced. The court record exceeded 22,000 pages. Behind those numbers were years of investigation into people who had disappeared from the boarding house and into the circumstances surrounding their deaths. The prosecution's theory centered on money. The residents were vulnerable, and some received government assistance or other payments. Prosecutors argued that Puente could benefit from those funds after the residents died. The alleged motive was therefore economic rather than a search for fame or notoriety. That distinction matters because it changes the way the case should be understood. The victims were not selected because they were famous. They were not people whose deaths would automatically attract national attention. Their vulnerability, according to the prosecution, was precisely what made them useful targets. The circumstances of the victims also explain why the case carries a broader social warning. A person who is elderly, poor, struggling with addiction, or dependent upon assistance can be more difficult for the outside world to monitor. If that person stops appearing, there may not be an immediate network of people demanding answers. The Puente case showed how dangerous that invisibility can become, but it also showed the power of attention. Judy Moise did not allow Montoya's absence to become meaningless. She knew that he was supposed to attend appointments. When he stopped appearing, she noticed the change. When Puente's explanations did not make sense, Moise remained concerned. That concern ultimately brought investigators to the house. The first body led to another discovery, and another, until 7 people had been recovered from the backyard. The investigation then moved from the physical property to the lives of the residents. Who were they? When had they disappeared? What circumstances surrounded their deaths? What evidence connected Puente to each individual case? Those questions eventually led to the 1993 trial. Puente's flight from Sacramento after the bodies were discovered also became an important moment in the investigation. She left the city carrying approximately $3,000 and was eventually arrested in Los Angeles. But even her arrest could not answer every question. It could only begin the process of determining what the evidence would establish. On December 10, 1993, the process ended with a sentence of life imprisonment without parole. The jury had deadlocked on the question of the death penalty, so Puente avoided execution. She remained in prison until her death on March 27, 2011. With her death, one chapter of the case closed. But the questions surrounding the 6 unresolved charges did not disappear. Neither did the larger questions about vulnerability, trust, and visibility. What happened at the boarding house became notorious because of what was found beneath the garden. Yet the garden itself was not the true beginning of the story. The beginning was in the lives of the people who entered the house seeking somewhere to live. It was in the vulnerability that brought them there. It was in the disappearance that someone finally noticed. And it was in the questions that followed. The most haunting element of the case may therefore be the contrast between the ordinary and the hidden. A home can appear to be a place of safety. A garden can appear to be simply a garden. A missing person can initially seem to have merely moved away. But when those assumptions are never questioned, the truth can remain concealed. In Sacramento, someone eventually questioned them. That question uncovered 7 bodies and led to 3 murder convictions. It also revealed the limits of what could be proven. The case should be remembered with both realities intact. Dorothea Puente was convicted of killing Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. She was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. 6 additional murder charges remained without verdicts. Those facts are not competing versions of the story. They are the story. And beneath the legal record are the people who should remain at its center. Their lives were not defined by the house where they died. Their identities were not created by the investigation. They were human beings whose lives mattered before investigators found their remains. The garden could hide their bodies, but it could not erase the questions surrounding their disappearance. It could not erase their names. And once investigators began digging, it could no longer hide the truth that had been waiting beneath the surface. The final lesson of the Dorothea Puente case is therefore not simply that evil can exist behind an ordinary door. It is that vulnerable people need to be seen. They need others to notice when something changes, to question explanations that do not make sense, and to remember that a person does not become less important simply because fewer people are watching. In this case, one missing man prompted one concerned social worker to ask one simple question. Where had he gone? That question opened the investigation. The answers led beneath the garden, and what investigators found there ensured that the people who had disappeared would never again be invisible. By the time Dorothea Puente's case reached trial in 1993, the investigation had already exposed a disturbing history surrounding her Sacramento boarding house. 7 bodies had been recovered from the property in November 1988. 9 people were ultimately named as alleged victims in the prosecution. Puente had fled Sacramento after the discoveries, carrying approximately $3,000, and was eventually arrested in Los Angeles. But the courtroom could not simply reproduce the horror of the investigation. It had to answer a narrower and more demanding question. Which deaths could the prosecution prove were murders committed by Dorothea Puente? That distinction became the central challenge of the trial. The case was enormous. 156 witnesses testified. More than 3,100 exhibits were introduced. The court record eventually exceeded 22,000 pages. Behind those numbers was an attempt to reconstruct the lives and deaths of people who had lived in the boarding house, disappeared, and eventually became part of a homicide investigation. The prosecution's case rested on a combination of circumstances surrounding individual victims and a Broader theory about Puente's motives. Prosecutors argued that she exploited people who were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable. Some residents received government assistance or other payments, and the prosecution argued that Puente could benefit from those payments after the residents died. The alleged motive was therefore financial. According to prosecutors, the value of the tenants did not end with their lives because their money, benefits, or identities could still be used. That theory was particularly significant in the case of Dorothy Miller. Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Prosecutors argued that Puente poisoned her with medication and later used Miller's identification to obtain medical services. The allegation provided a concrete example of the financial exploitation theory. Miller was not simply someone who had died while living at the house. According to the prosecution, her identity itself had been used after her disappearance. That evidence helped prosecutors argue that Miller's death had served a purpose for Puente. The case involving Benjamin Fink had a different set of circumstances, but fit the prosecution's larger narrative. Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived at Puente's boarding house and disappeared in April 1988. Before his disappearance, Puente reportedly told another tenant that she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable. Prosecutors presented the statement as part of the evidence surrounding his final days. In the context of the prosecution's case, the words took on a darker significance. But the jury still had to evaluate them alongside the rest of the evidence rather than treating a single statement as automatic proof of murder. Leona Carpenter was the third victim whose death ultimately resulted in a conviction. Together, Miller, Fink, and Carpenter became the three murder cases in which the prosecution successfully established Puente's guilt beyond the required legal standard. But the trial also contained 6 other murder allegations. Those 6 cases presented the jury with a different problem. The fact that several people had died in connection with the same boarding house could suggest a common pattern. But a pattern alone could not substitute for proof of each individual murder. The jury had to examine the evidence charge by charge. That requirement created an important boundary between the public image of the case and its legal outcome. Outside the courtroom, the discovery of 7 bodies could create the impression of a single, complete story. Inside the courtroom, the jury had to separate the cases. Who was the victim? What happened to that person? What evidence connected Puente to the death? Was the evidence sufficient to establish murder? Those questions had to be answered individually. The prosecution attempted to establish a broader context through testimony and documentary evidence. The 156 witnesses helped reconstruct the circumstances surrounding the residence and the boarding house. Thousands of exhibits gave the jury an enormous body of material to consider. The sheer volume of evidence reflected the complexity of a case in which the alleged crimes had not occurred during one clearly defined incident. They involved different people, different periods, and different circumstances. The jury therefore faced the task of finding a coherent conclusion without allowing the overall horror of the case to determine the outcome of every individual charge. This was especially important because the investigation had begun with one missing person. Alvaro Bert Montoya had been referred to Puente's boarding house by social worker Judy Moise. When Montoya stopped attending his appointments, Moise became concerned. She questioned Puente about his whereabouts and found the explanations inconsistent. That concern ultimately helped bring investigators to the property. Once the backyard was examined and bodies were discovered, the scope of the investigation expanded dramatically. Yet even that discovery did not automatically establish Puente's responsibility for every death. The prosecution still had to build individual cases. This is one of the most important features of the trial because it demonstrates the difference between an investigation and a conviction. Investigators can pursue a theory based on patterns, circumstances, and suspicion. Prosecutors can bring charges when they believe the evidence supports them. But jurors must decide whether the evidence meets the legal standard for guilt. In Puente's case, the answer was not the same for every charge. After weeks of deliberation, the jury convicted Puente of 3 counts of first-degree murder. The victims were Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. On the 6 remaining murder counts, however, the jury could not reach verdicts. The result was therefore neither a complete acceptance nor a complete rejection of the prosecutions. Broader theory: 3 murders had been established to the jury's satisfaction. 6 allegations remained unresolved. That outcome is essential to understanding what the trial actually proved. Puente was not convicted of 9 murders. She was convicted of 3. The 6 remaining charges were not transformed into convictions simply because they had been prosecuted alongside the 3 successful cases. The jury's inability to agree left those allegations without a verdict. For the victims associated with those unresolved charges, that meant the courtroom did not provide the same legal conclusion. It also demonstrated the limits of the evidence available to the prosecution. The verdict did not erase the significance of the 7 bodies found at the property, but it prevented the case from being reduced to a simple equation: 7 bodies. Therefore, 7 murders committed by one person. The legal process required more. It required evidence capable of connecting a specific defendant to a specific crime. The sentencing phase produced another moment of uncertainty. Because Puente had been convicted of 3 first-degree murders, the question of punishment became critical. The prosecution sought the death penalty, but the jury could not reach a unanimous decision on whether she should be executed. That deadlock meant Puente avoided the death penalty. Instead, on December 10, 1993, she was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence guaranteed that she would spend the remainder of her life in prison. It also closed the formal criminal proceedings against her. Yet the outcome carried an unusual sense of incompleteness. The prosecution had presented an enormous case. The jury had heard from 156 witnesses and considered more than 3,100 exhibits. The court record stretched beyond 22,000 pages. And after all that evidence, the final legal answer consisted of 3 convictions and 6 unresolved charges. That may appear unsatisfying, but it is precisely why the distinction between evidence and assumption matters. A true crime narrative can be compelling without pretending to know more than the record establishes. The case of Dorothea Puente offers a particularly clear example of that principle. The investigation revealed a shocking concentration of deaths. The prosecution presented a financial motive. Puente fled after the bodies were discovered. Witnesses described circumstances surrounding individual residents, and the jury ultimately found her guilty of 3 murders. But none of those facts justified changing 6 unresolved allegations into convictions. The verdict, therefore, did more than determine Puente's punishment. It defined the limits of what could responsibly be said about her crimes. Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter were legally recognized as victims of murders committed by Puente. The other 6 alleged victims remained outside that conclusion. Their deaths remained part of the history of the investigation, but the jury did not reach a verdict assigning those murders to Puente. That distinction should remain visible even decades later. Puente would spend the rest of her life in prison and die there on March 27, 2011. But the most important outcome of the trial was not the notoriety attached to her name. It was the recognition of 3 individual victims whose deaths had been investigated and proven in court. Their stories had begun as lives lived outside the courtroom. They ended as evidence in one of Sacramento's most extraordinary murder trials. The verdict could not restore them, and it could not answer every question raised by the bodies discovered in the backyard. But it established what the jury could prove: 3 convictions, 6 unresolved charges, 1 life sentence without parole, and a permanent reminder that even in the most disturbing criminal cases, the search for truth depends upon respecting the difference between what appears to be true and what can actually be proven. By the time Dorothea Puente died in prison on March 27, 2011, The investigation that had begun in a Sacramento backyard was already more than 2 decades old. The discovery of 7 bodies had transformed a boarding house into one of the most notorious crime scenes associated with Sacramento. And the name Dorothea Puente had become permanently connected to the deaths of vulnerable people who had lived under her roof. Yet the legal record was more precise than the reputation that followed her. Puente was convicted of 3 first-degree murders: Dorothy Miller, Benjamin Fink, and Leona Carpenter. 6 other murder charges remained unresolved because the jury could not reach verdicts. She received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole on December 10, 1993, after the jury also deadlocked over the question of the death penalty. Those facts are important because the legacy of a criminal case can easily become larger than the evidence that established it. Over time, the number of bodies discovered, the shocking setting, and the image of the landlady can overshadow the individual victims and the limits of what the courtroom actually proved. But the people at the center of this story were not symbols. They were residents who had lives before they became part of a homicide investigation. Dorothy Miller was 64 years old and a veteran. She was last seen in October 1987. Prosecutors argued that she had been poisoned with medication and that Puente later used Miller's identification. That evidence became part of the prosecution's theory that financial exploitation was a motive. Benjamin Fink was 55 and struggled with alcoholism. He lived at Puente's boarding house and disappeared in April 1988. A statement attributed to Puente, in which she said she would take Fink upstairs and make him comfortable, became part of the evidence presented against her. Leona Carpenter was the 3rd victim whose death the jury determined had been caused by Puente. Their cases formed the legal foundation of the life sentence that kept Puente in prison for the remainder of her life. But there were other names, other disappearances, and other questions. 6 additional murder charges had been brought against Puente, yet the jury could not reach a verdict on them. That uncertainty should not be treated as a footnote. It is part of the case's meaning. The investigation had uncovered a disturbing concentration of deaths, but the courtroom did not provide a complete legal explanation for every one of them. The difference between the number of allegations and the number of convictions demonstrates how difficult it can be to reconstruct events that occurred years earlier, particularly when the victims were people whose lives had already been difficult for others to follow. The case began to unravel because one person's disappearance was noticed. Alvaro Bert Montoya had been referred to Puente's boarding house by social worker Judy Moise. When he stopped attending appointments, Moise became concerned. Puente gave explanations about Montoya's whereabouts, but they were inconsistent. That inconsistency mattered because it challenged the possibility that Montoya had simply disappeared for an ordinary reason. The concern led investigators to examine the property. Once they began digging in the backyard, the investigation changed forever. The first body was found, then another, then another. By November 1988, 7 bodies had been recovered from the grounds of the house. The physical discoveries forced investigators to look backward and reconsider people who had disappeared from the boarding house. The house was no longer viewed simply as a place where vulnerable residents lived. It had become the center of a homicide investigation. And Puente, who had operated the property, became the focus of that investigation. Her decision to leave Sacramento after the bodies were discovered intensified the search for her. She reportedly took approximately $3,000 and eventually traveled to Los Angeles, where she was arrested. But the arrest did not automatically resolve the case. It only brought the suspect into custody. Investigators and prosecutors still had to establish which deaths could be connected to Puente, strongly enough to support criminal convictions. That process ultimately required years of preparation and an enormous trial. In 1993, 156 witnesses testified. More than 3,100 exhibits were introduced. The court record exceeded 22,000 pages. Those figures illustrate how much effort was required to transform the investigation into a legal case. The prosecution's theory centered on money. Some residents were elderly, poor, or otherwise vulnerable, and some received government assistance or other payments. Prosecutors argued that Puente could benefit from those payments after residents died. The alleged motive was therefore financial exploitation. The theory was especially significant because it offered an explanation for why the victims' circumstances mattered. Their vulnerability was not merely part of the background. According to prosecutors, it created the opportunity for Puente to profit from their deaths. The allegation concerning Miller's identification was particularly important in that context. Prosecutors argued that Puente used Miller's identity to obtain medical services after Miller had disappeared. The prosecution presented this as evidence that Miller's identity remained financially useful after her death. That allegation supported the larger argument that Puente's relationship with vulnerable tenants had been exploited for personal gain. Yet the broader lesson of the case is not simply about money. It is about trust. People came to the boarding house because they needed somewhere to live. They were not necessarily in a position to choose from an abundance of safe alternatives. Some were dealing with poverty, age, addiction, or other difficulties. Their circumstances could make them dependent upon the person providing their housing. That dependence created an imbalance of power. According to the prosecution, Puente exploited that imbalance. The case therefore remains disturbing because the setting was so ordinary. The victims did not enter a place publicly identified as dangerous. They entered a home. A landlord was supposed to provide shelter, not become the person from whom residents needed protection. The betrayal of that expectation is one of the most enduring aspects of the story. It is also why the victim should remain at the center of any retelling. The phrase "death house landlady" is memorable, but it risks reducing the entire case to a label attached to one woman. The victims deserve more than that. They deserve to be remembered as people whose lives existed before the investigation. Their vulnerability should not become a reason to overlook their humanity. Dorothy Miller was not simply one of the names in a murder indictment. She was a veteran. Benjamin Fink was not simply a man whose disappearance became evidence. He was a person struggling with alcoholism. Leona Carpenter was not simply the third conviction. She was an individual whose death ultimately became one of the crimes proven against Puente. And Montoya's role in the investigation reminds us that a missing person does not have to be famous or surrounded by a large family to deserve attention. One social worker noticed that he had stopped appearing. That observation became the first step toward uncovering the bodies. The case, therefore, carries a lesson that extends beyond the courtroom. Vulnerable people can become invisible when their lives are not closely connected to institutions, families, or communities capable of noticing changes. A missed appointment can seem insignificant. A disappearance can be explained away. A person can appear to have simply moved somewhere else. But when several small questions are allowed to accumulate, they can reveal something much larger. In the Puente case, the questions eventually led to the garden. The garden exposed the deaths, but it also exposed the importance of paying attention to the living. The people who disappeared had not ceased to matter simply because their circumstances made them easier to overlook. Their absence mattered. Their names mattered. Their stories mattered. The investigation demonstrated that clearly. The trial demonstrated something else. Even when a case appears overwhelming, the legal system must still distinguish between what is suspected and what is proven. That distinction can sometimes leave an unsettling sense of incompleteness. 3 murders resulted in convictions. 6 additional charges did not. The jury could not reach a verdict on those 6 allegations, and no responsible account should transform those unresolved counts into convictions that never occurred. This limitation does not weaken the significance of the 3 convictions. It strengthens the importance of accuracy. Puente spent the rest of her life in prison because a jury found her guilty of 3 first-degree murders. She died there in 2011. Her punishment was final, but the lives of the victims remained the deeper subject of the case. The final image is not the courtroom, the sentence, or the woman whose name became famous. It is the ordinary house and the people who entered it looking for somewhere to live. Beneath the garden were the remains of people whose disappearances had gone unanswered until someone finally asked questions. Above the ground, life continued as if nothing had happened. The horror was hidden by normality. But normality was also what allowed the investigation to begin. A person missed an appointment. Someone noticed. An explanation did not make sense. Someone asked again. And eventually, investigators dug. The legacy of the Dorothea Puente case is therefore not only the story of a convicted serial killer. It is a reminder of what can happen when vulnerable people become invisible, and of what can happen when someone refuses to let that invisibility continue. The case ended with a life sentence, but its most enduring message lies elsewhere. Every disappearance deserves to be taken seriously, every vulnerable person deserves to be seen, and every accusation must be measured against the evidence that can actually be proven. In the end, the garden could hide bodies, but it could not permanently erase their stories. Once the questions began, the silence could not hold forever.